Hi, I'm Paul Marston, and this is the last of a set of 4 talks about people and events surrounding Easter. And this particular one is about the events surrounding the resurrection. So I'm just going to go to the PowerPoint. The resurrection then of Jesus of Nazareth. Well, the main part of this present talk will be to piece together the 4 gospel accounts of the resurrection. And to help with this, I have a Word document setting these out side by side, which would help people follow the talk. If you haven't got one, you would like one, please email me on dr.paul.marston@btinternet.com and I'll gladly email you one. But we can first ask, does it matter? Does it matter whether or not Jesus rose from the dead? Well, obviously, I think it does. But the point is that Christianity is based on Jesus Christ, or Jesus the Messiah, who was crucified around 29 AD near Jerusalem, but whose followers claimed that he rose from the dead. And in a sense, Christianity is uniquely historical. Jesus didn't just bring the message, he was the message. Jesus' death and resurrection are claimed to bring forgiveness, new life, and hope. And early Christians, like the Apostle Paul, did not only appeal to experience, they also appealed both to nature and to history for evidence that Christianity was true. It's a book I wrote with Roger Forster fairly recently, and it looks at the evidence from science or nature, from history, and from personal experience that Christianity is actually true, not simply a nice story. Well, as we said, Christianity is based on Jesus, and the 4 main sources for Christians are the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These were written originally in the 1st century in Greek. But we can ask, sometimes people do, are there alternative Gospels which are really just ignored by Christians? And the simple answer is no. Our 4 Gospels all contain known geographical and historical features impossible to know after the 1st century. Fake Gospels, in contrast, like Barnabas and Judas, do not contain such details, and usually their Jesus is not a 1st century Jew in any sense that we'd recognise from other sources. At the most, some sources with a similar picture of Jesus may contain some genuine saying of his, or even sayings possibly. But then we can ask, are the 4 Gospels really history? Well, a long part of my teaching as a senior lecturer at the University of Central Lancashire has been on the philosophy and history of science, so I have an interest in the nature of history. And people don't always realise that history is not just what happened, it's the reconstruction of the past in human language and perspective. It inevitably and always involves some selection, what's important, perspective, inevitably there is some slant, and telescoping of events, missing out the bits you don't think are very important. Okay, well, the basic facts, insofar as we can check inscriptions, the Gospel and the Acts are accurate. And for example, the first inscription on Pilate was found in 1961. We find that the 2nd century secular historians Tacitus, Pliny, and Suetonius say exactly what we might expect about the Christians. The late 1st century Jewish historian Josephus and the late 2nd century Jewish Mishnah say exactly what we might expect to find with them to say about Jesus and Christians. Okay, well, what about the resurrection itself? How you assess the evidence will depend, of course, on your worldview. Even seeing is not believing if it makes no sense to you. I've seen a man in Blackpool produce live pigeons out of a hat that was empty, but I don't really believe it happened because it makes no sense. And this applies to everything. If your worldview assumes there's nothing outside the physical, then no amount of evidence will convince you that Jesus rose from the dead. But assuming that we set aside that kind of inbuilt skepticism and look at the accounts, we can first ask what kinds of alternatives people have suggested to explain away the resurrection accounts naturalistically, and how plausible these alternatives are. Well, here's one. It was a hoax. The body was stolen in order to fool people and make people believe Jesus was resurrected. So a few famous books I've just cited that have made exactly these claims. Well, the questions here would be, what would be Jesus' motives? He already had fame, he already had a following. What would be the point? And secondly, is there any point in supporting high morality with a lie? And who else would steal the body but him and his disciples if it was a hoax? But what hoax? What would then happen? He'd come back and presumably eventually get caught again and he'd be re-crucified. So what would be the point of the whole thing, really? Okay, the second one is that he recovered, suggested by this book. Questions about that. So in other words, he recovered, he got over his injuries on the cross, and then he went about having a full life. Well, a couple of basic issues with this. Firstly, could they really fool the Romans into believing he was dead? One of the gospel writers even said that the governor, Pilate, asked the centurion to go and double check, and he did. And secondly, why make up a lie? And then thirdly, what about, again, rearrest? If he recovered, surely the disciples would all want to keep a low profile, or he'd just be rearrested and crucified again. Okay, how about that it was a mistake, suggested by M. Wilson, that the early church mistook his brother James for Jesus? Well, a couple of questions about that, really. Joseph and Nicodemus, who buried him, were men of substance. Surely they knew who they were burying, and surely they knew where the tomb was. And then secondly, James himself was an early church leader. So how could they have possibly made that mistake? Okay, a last one is that it was actually hallucination, which I finally got up. So questions about these would be this kind of theory. They didn't expect a resurrection, and different types of people all would have to be hallucinate together. And finally, they didn't seem to quite recognize him, whereas in a hallucination you'd be pretty sure. Then there's a final one. How about a legend? Well, Wells suggests that there is a legend built up. The problem with this is no time for legend to spring up. The Gospels were written in the 1st century, and they have very specific descriptions, which are seldom there in legends. So these, if you like, are alternative theories. I don't find any of them very convincing. But how can we assess the orthodox view, the view that the Gospel events really did happen? Secondly, does it make sense? Thirdly, do the accounts fit together? And we can ask, in looking at this, what are the signs for independent reports of real events? They have to be accurate about contemporary detail. They have to be consistent with each other. And a part of one account may make sense only in the light of another to give the whole picture. So this is what we'll be looking for. So let's look at some of the people involved. Well, 2 members of the Jewish High Council. We don't really know what they look like, of course. It's just 2 painting, or a film and a painting idea. Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus took the body to the tomb, rapidly wrapped it up and buried it, because the day of Passover was about to start that evening, and they shouldn't be touching dead bodies on that day. Then we've got 2 leading disciples, Simon Johnson, who Jesus nicknamed Rocky, or Peter, or Cephas, and John Zebedee, who also actually had a nickname, and that was Thunder Boy. He was Jesus' cousin, also called the beloved disciple. So that's 2 disciples. Then we've got other apostles. We've got John's brother James. We've got a couple more cousins of Jesus, Joseph and James the Less, and Thomas, and various others, most of whose names you can't remember. Then we've got immediate people involved. There were 4 immediate family members: Mary, Jesus' mother, of course; Salome, not the one who danced for Herod, but another Salome, who was Mary's sister and the mother of James and John. And there was also Clopas, or Cleopas, I think they're the same person, Joseph's brother, and his wife Mary, who was the other Mary, who also had 2 sons who were disciples. So these are family members who are involved. This actually shows you a kind of family tree as we can reconstruct it. Zebedee and Salome had James and John. Mary and Joseph, well, Mary had Jesus, and of course they both had James, Jesus' half-brother. And then Cleopas, or Clopas, married Mary, who was also, they were also related to Mary and Joseph, because Cleopas was Joseph's brother. So Mary was also Jesus' aunt, and she was the mother of Joseph and James the younger. So it's quite a family tree there, really. There's a couple of other people involved. Afraid there's yet another Mary, but maybe only one. Mary Magdalene, whom he'd healed, and I think to be identified with Mary of Bethany, the sister of Martha and Lazarus. Now, there's no certainty about that. I'm not the only one that thinks that. But we find that it's a bit like if you've ever been to a play where there's only a small cast and you know that the Pirate King will never come on at the same time as the King of the Fairies because it's the same actor. Well, we find that Mary Magdalene and Mary of Bethany are both central characters, and yet they never appear on stage together. So many of us believe that they're just different names, much as the other Mary is called the other Mary. She's also the wife of Cleopas. She's also the mother of Joseph. She's also the mother of another James. And she's all of these. So it's the same Mary, but described in different ways. And I think this is true for Mary Magdalene, but it's not essential to the story. I think it just adds a bit to it. And then we've got a couple of others, aristocrats really. Joanna, the wife of Herod's steward, Chusa, and Susanna. We don't know much about her really, but she also appears in the scene. So here's some places involved. We've got, first of all, Gethsemane, which is just outside the walls of Jerusalem at that time and going over to the east. Then we've got the tomb itself, at that time outside the city walls. It isn't anymore, of course. Then we've got John's house. He must have had a house somewhere in Jerusalem, we surmise from the accounts. And then we finally got Herod's palace, which is probably where Joanna would have stayed. And then about a mile and a half in that direction is Bethany, where Jesus had friends and where, you know, it would be a safe place to run to when Jesus was arrested in Gethsemane. Most of the disciples, I think, probably ran the other way. These are the these are the places shown in relief. So you've got Jerusalem. To get to Bethany, you go up over the Mount of Olives from Gethsemane and then down through Bethphage, and you eventually arrive at Bethany. It's only about a mile and a half, so it's a bit further than a Sabbath day walk in Jewish terms. Okay, now we can ask, or people ask, well, who wrote the Gospels? We don't really ask that quite, but under whose authority were they compiled? And my belief is that the Gospel of Matthew was compiled with the authority of Matthew Levi, the disciple. Mark, by John Mark, recording the perspective of Peter. That's what is said by one of the early church writers. Luke, recording a kind of global view, but particularly of Jesus' mother, Mary, and the other women. And finally, John, the beloved disciple, John, Jesus' cousin. And of course, being so, you know, John's mother, Salome, was the sister of Mary. So those are who I think wrote, or not wrote, but had the fundamental authority under whom they were compiled. We need to know a little bit about Jewish burials. Usually what Jewish people would do is to wait for the body to rot and then put bones in a bone casket. So usually the body was put into a tomb, sealed with a large flat circular stone to wait till the body had rotted. It would be heavily anointed with spices when it was put in. Okay, now I'm going to do some models of events, and as in my previous three talks, I'm presenting a model that I believe best fits all the reliable accounts we have of the four Gospels. In my various reconstructions, some things are certain, some likely, and some just possible. So to give some examples, for Jewish people, a day started at sunset. The Jewish day of preparation began in the evening, maybe with some small ceremony. And the following day, the lambs were killed in the temple, ready for them to eat in the Paschal meal. That's the following evening. And the following evening then marked the start of the actual Passover day, and that's when the lambs were eaten. All four Gospels say Jesus ate the Last Supper on the evening which began the day of preparation. So this is certain. He didn't eat it on what was the Passover day for the Jews at that time. But that raises a further question, because the lambs had to be sacrificed in the temple on the day of preparation. It's very unlikely that if he had the Last Supper the previous evening, that he could have had a distinctive Passover meal with elements like the lamb. But how then are we to interpret the Gospels of Matthew, Mark and Luke when they talk about the disciples going to prepare the Passover? Either we have to take them to refer to the Passover as a kind of general period, starting with some quasi-ceremonial meal on the day of preparation, or we have to take it that Jesus did in some way regard the Last Supper as a kind of Passover meal, but without its key elements like the lamb. That last is the view shared, for example, by the prominent scholars N.T. Wright and the late R.T. France. They think that he regarded it as a kind of Passover meal, but it only had a couple of the elements. It didn't have the lamb or any of the main elements. So on these issues, there are arguments on both sides, but no obvious answer. Incidentally, you can email me if you want my analysis of it. Of course, it's not an issue which much affects our Christian lives, exactly how much of the Passover meal was in the Last Supper. So there's some things which are certain, some things which we can guess at. And on other issues in my talks, I've made suggestions which made sense of events, but for which there's no direct evidence. So, for example, I suggested that Caiaphas sent Pilate a message on the night he arrested Jesus to say he would bring a person for sentence next morning. This would well explain both the interchange next morning when they brought Jesus and also Pilate's wife's nightmares. But we can't be certain. Some of the suggestions I've made are plausible but can't be assumed with any high probability. For example, Mary of Bethany and Mary Magdalene is the same person. But overall, I believe that my models fit what we know from the Gospels, and the 4 accounts of the resurrection can be harmonised, and this is done in the 3 books which are on screen now, 2 of which I was co-author of. One was a classic by John Wenham, which do, in different places, piece together these accounts in some detail, which is what we're about to do. Okay, so to start with, during the arrest in Gethsemane, most disciples fled to Bethany. There was a rapid entombment by Nicodemus and Joseph because Passover day was coming. They needed to wait probably to the end of 2 Sabbaths, but certainly at least 1 before completing the burial anointing. The 2nd Sabbath would end at sunset, and I'm suggesting that Mary Magdalene, whose brother and sister were there, and Cleopas' wife Mary, whose 2 sons were there, began towards Bethany, doing 1 mile before sunset, just going out of Jerusalem, and the last half mile afterwards, and so on the next day to them down the hill towards the lights of Bethany. So this would mean that if we look at, and this is section A in the notes if you've got them, this is the position that they're going to be in on that night, the night after the 2nd Sabbath. I suggested that when Jesus is arrested in Gethsemane, most of the disciples would run naturally in the other direction, which was Bethany, somewhere a little bit safer to wait until they saw how things would turn out. So here, A is the location of people during this night, the day after the Sabbath. Remember, the new day started at sunset, not dawn. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, who's Jesus' aunt and the mother of 2 disciples, James the Less and Joseph, is married to Cleopas, as I've already said, gone to Bethany, where both have close relatives in order to keep them informed. Okay, so if we go to the next picture, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary have been overnight in Bethany, where the other Matthew and the others were. So from Matthew's point of view, they set out very early. He says it's dawning. John, who is dramatically recording just the experience of Mary Magdalene for reasons which we might look at later, says that she actually started when it was still dark. So it was just about the point where it's still dark and turning to dawn when she sets out. Well, the 2 women may not have travelled alone. They might have gone with Cleopas. But anyway, the women who were going to anoint the body, that's what we're told in the accounts. So somewhere around this point, we have Matthew's account of the angels appearing, or angel appearing, and the guards fainting. Matthew's telescoping events here. I don't think there's any reason to believe that the women saw the angel descend and the stone rolled back, nor should we suppose that they had to pick their way over the prostrate bodies of unconscious guards to get to the tomb. That would be rather odd. I believe that by the time they got there, the guards had recovered, seen the empty tomb and run away, but Matthew just telescopes the events together. So Salome is the mother of John and the sister of Mary, Jesus' mother, and she stayed obviously with her sister at John's house overnight. Jesus' mother's probably too upset to go to anoint the body, but Salome joins the other two Marys to go to the tomb with expensive ointments to anoint the body properly. Note, by the way, that they were evidently not expecting a resurrection. They took spices to anoint a dead body. They didn't go to celebrate a live one. Okay, so en route, we imagine that they pick up Joanna, who's the wife of Herod's steward, from the palace. Maybe Susanna, we don't know much about her, where she came from. As I say, Matthew, in his dramatic account, telescopes events, but it's clear that by the time they reach the tomb, the angel who frightened the guard is inside the tomb with a companion. They seem not to have even known about any guards, and as they approach are discussing who's going to roll back this massive stone put in place by Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. How are we going to even get into the tomb to do the anointing? Okay, now it's interesting that it's Mark who tells us when they looked up, they saw the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. This implies that they saw it from some distance away. But John tells us that at this point, before she looked inside, Mary Magdalene jumped to the conclusion that the body had been moved. And so she runs back to tell Peter and John. Okay, now, when she gets to Peter and John, she frantically bangs on the door. You imagine they wondered what on earth it was. Was it guards come to arrest the men? Anyway, Peter and John go to the door to answer it. And she gasps out, "They've taken the Lord out of the tomb and we do not know where they laid him." Now, what's interesting about this is that John has mentioned only her. So why does she say we? Well, is it a royal we? No, because later she meets someone she thinks is the gardener at the tomb and she says, "They've taken the Lord out of the tomb and I do not know where they've laid him." By this time, she's lost contact with the other women. They might have found the body by now. Well, John knows very well that there were other women with her. Of course he does, because one was his mum and the other his aunt, and they all left from his house. But these words of hers were a turning point in his life. We often remember with great vividness words which are very important to us. He remembers them and records them exactly and vividly. It's her story he's telling, but also his own, of course. The body is gone. And that's what she said. The rest of the women go into the tomb and see two scary men in white. Angels, they conclude. One of the angels is a spokesperson and gives them a message to take to the 11 disciples. Okay, so at this point, we find that Peter and John have heard Mary Magdalene's breathless message. She'd rushed off to the tomb. When they arrive, they find it empty. They miss the women on the way through Jerusalem, find it empty with the grave clothes still there, but no body. And as it records, of course, Peter doesn't know what to make of it, but John believes at that point. They miss the other women, as I say, and they just, the women are returning to say they've seen the angels or men in white, but Peter and John don't see anything. Mary Magdalene, of course, has no hope of keeping up with Peter and John. Peter can't even keep up with John, but she goes back to the tomb, presumably at her own pace, and still believing that the body has disappeared. Okay, so the next thing that we would find is that the women are back at the house recovering. Peter and John are coming back a bit mystified. And Mary is making her own way back to the tomb. So Peter and John are going to join the others back at John's house, if you like, and Mary's going off to the tomb. Well, the next thing that happens is that Mary reaches the tomb and sees some angels. Meanwhile, the other women were given a message for the disciples, so they obviously wait for Peter and John to get back to start doing this. Peter and John are the first two disciples to hear. We don't know if there was one other or maybe there, but at least the Peter and John here. But the women are going to have to run out to Bethany to tell the other disciples because they want to deliver the message. Now, I have to say, Luke seems to have Mary Magdalene amongst them telling the disciples about the angels. Personally, I think he's just telescoping events. But there are ways you can possibly make it differently. But anyway, Peter, in Luke's account, seems not to have heard anyone actually claim to have seen Jesus when he runs to the tomb. Meanwhile, Mary is unknowingly meeting angels at the tomb, and the women are delivering their message to Peter and John, presumably having their equivalent of a cup of tea, and then running off towards Bethany. Then it's all happening. Mary Magdalene meets Jesus at the tomb, but the other women are going off to deliver their message. It's 1.5 miles from Jerusalem to Bethany, and at some point along the way, running along the way, they meet Jesus himself. And this is recorded in Matthew. So when they get to Bethany and they tell Matthew, he puts it all together. They saw the angels at the tomb, and then running along to tell the disciples, they saw Jesus as well. So his account, as I've said, is a kind of telescope version of events. Also, meantime, Cleopas and a friend, some suggest his wife Mary, although I think she's more likely to have gone off to Bethany. But anyway, he and a friend set out for Emmaus on their way to meet, and on the way they meet Jesus. In fact, what Luke says the Emmaus travellers told Jesus matches exactly what they should have said at this point. They don't mention anyone claiming to have seen Jesus. They report the women going to the tomb and seeing angels, and they report Peter finding the tomb empty, although Luke puts it in a slightly different order, but we know that the Gospels were not necessarily completely chronological. They're pretty chronological, because obviously if you're recording a resurrection, it's got to happen after crucifixion. But in general, if the order was slightly altered, the early church didn't worry too much. Just note earlier, Luke has referred to 2 men in dazzling white clothes at the tomb. But here, the travellers report that the women have seen a vision of angels. There's no contradiction. Angels look like men in white clothes. They don't have wings and all that kind of stuff that are in, Christmas cards. So anyway, there's no contradiction there. And they don't report that the women have seen Jesus, because they haven't seen Jesus yet. They're on the way to Bethany, and Magdalene hasn't returned yet. Finally, realizing who this really is, of course, they race back to Jerusalem to get there before the curfew. Okay, so this is the picture then. When they get back to the disciples, apart from Thomas, the disciples have come back from Bethany, apart from Thomas, so they're all gathered there. There are claims that Jesus has appeared to Peter. Paul mentions this in 1 Corinthians 15:5. But the room is a turmoil of disbelief, struggling belief and faith in the various stories of meeting angels and of meeting Jesus himself. Many manuscripts end Mark's Gospel at verse 8, but it's obvious it can't have been originally ended there, because it said they run off and said nothing to anybody, and they can't mean forever, or we wouldn't know what had happened. And they begin a message for the disciples. So some very early scribe has added verses 9 to 20, but actually they tie in perfectly well with the other accounts. Mark records the skepticism met both by Mary and the 2 on the Emmaus Road, but obviously the reactions in the room were really mixed. Some were saying the Lord has risen and indeed appeared to Simon, and others were doubting. You find later on that some doubted at different times, and there wasn't kind of uniform immediate belief. Then Jesus himself appears in the room. He appears again, of course, a week later with Thomas there this time, and at various other times in Galilee. But we won't really need to go into the other appearances here, because they're more spaced out in time, so there's no problem in collating them. Okay, a few points to make about this. As we assess eyewitness accounts, we should look for incidental corroboration, parts of one account that make sense only in light of details in another account. There's 2 here. Mary and John, as I've said, says, we do not know where they've laid him, and later, I do not know where they've laid him. As I've said, we find for the other gospel accounts that, of course, there are other women with her, but John hasn't mentioned them. So this is a kind of incidental corroboration. Secondly, Mark notes that when they looked up, they saw the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. So the idea of when they looked up, they didn't just kind of stumble almost up to the tomb. They were looking from a distance and saw it had been rolled back. And then John says that Mary saw the stone had been rolled back, no angels, but from a distance. Maybe she was the youngest one, the others were mostly fairly matronly, came running back to Peter and John. So those two things tie quite well together. And then in perspectives, well, each gospel is from the perspective in the drama which the authority behind it would have seen, and that's quite important. Another important point is that no one claims to have seen the resurrection itself. There is an apocryphal account which has the angels dramatically rolling the stone back and Jesus striding out, about 12 foot tall between the two of them. But if you were making up an account of the resurrection, surely you'd make up an account of him coming out in glory and Peter falling on his knees with the other disciples outside the tomb. But there isn't such an account. And then the first person to see him, at least recorded by John and Mark, was a woman of a dodgy or dubious background. And the angels give the key message to a group of women to go and tell the men. This is the opposite way round than Jewish people would do it, where usually, God spoke to men who talked to women. But here it's the other way around. In fact, there are churches today where they assume that God only speaks to men and they speak to the women. But the angels hadn't been going to those churches, and so they gave the key message to a bunch of women to go and take to the men. Who would make that up in first century Israel? Suppose contradictions. Well, one contradiction that's been suggested is that some gospels say angels, some say men, and one says one and one says two. Well, firstly, we should note that angels look like men. They don't have these wonderful wings and look like, Italian mistresses, which the paintings have. Luke speaks of men, but later on the Emmaus Road, they refer to visions of angels. So angels just look like men in white clothes. So to say that men in white clothes are angels, it's the same thing. There's no contradiction. And then, of course, we've also got Matthew telescoping events. We have to accept that some historians do that for dramatic reasons and miss out incidental bits or bits incidental to them. Matthew was telling the story as he'd heard it. Okay, some conclusions. Well, of course, it depends on your starting assumptions. It isn't a mass of contradictions, but on the other hand, I don't think you can prove it beyond reasonable doubt, as one book once claimed. I'm not sure you can prove anything much beyond the reasonable doubt, apart from the fact that you exist. And some philosophers have doubted even that. So it's somewhere in between. But the point is, it does make sense, and it makes sense of our human existence. So there we have the tomb, if you like, and that's what, of course, the angel said. He's not here, he is risen. Well, interestingly, a 2004 survey a little while ago, probably changed a bit since then, but it's still in our century. 47% of UK people believed in Jesus' resurrection. I found that amazing when I read it. But the point is this: if it's true, surely it should make some difference to your life. It's not just some kind of interesting story like, oh, fancy that. After all, I don't know, Robin Hood didn't really have a girlfriend called Maid Marian, which he probably didn't. Or, oh, fancy that, King Arthur never existed. I mean, those are interesting, but they don't really affect my life very much. On the other hand, if Jesus rose from the dead, it certainly has affected my life, and really it ought to affect yours. So it might be a good idea to just find out something a bit more about it. Okay, so anyway, that's the account as I have it of the things fitting together. Hope it's been useful to you. If you want to email me about anything, do feel free. But if you are a Christian, then at least it can give you a reassurance that you're not basing your faith on a fairy story which doesn't make sense. And if you're not a Christian, well, at least think about it. If Jesus really did rise from the dead, what difference is that going to make to my life in the future?